We already know how to graph quadratics by finding the vertex and the y-intercept. And before, we used a third point from symmetry to graph, but now we're able to find the x-intercepts as well. So first thing we want to do is to find the vertex, which first we find the x value, and x is equal to negative b over 2a. Once we have the x value of the vertex, to find the y-coordinate, we plug x into the equation, and then we solve for y. To find the y-intercept, when we have a y-intercept, the x value is always equal to 0. And to find the y-coordinate, you could either plug in 0 for the x's and solve for y, or you could just simply look at the c term. To find the x-intercepts, that's the newer things that we've been working with, and there's two things that we could do. So to find the x-coordinates, we could factor and set equal to 0, or we could use the quadratic formula. Now remember, you can use the quadratic formula every time, but I would say try to factor first. If you can factor, great. If you can't factor, then use the quadratic formula. When we have an x-intercept, the y value would be 0. And then once we have these points, remember we need 3 points to graph a parabola. So now that we know how to find the x-intercepts, we'll have more than 3 points. We plot our points and we can graph it. And remember that the a value tells us whether or not the graph opens up or down. So if a is greater than 0, remember that we have a smiley face. So that means that we have a minimum. And if a is less than 0, we have a frowny face, and we have a maximum. So for this example, we want to graph this. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to find the vertex. So we're going to do x equals negative b over 2a. So I'm going to make this negative 8 over 2. So we get negative 4. Now that I have the x value, I'm going to plug it back in. So negative 4 squared plus 8 times negative 4 plus 15. Okay, so make sure that when you're squaring something, especially a negative, that if you're putting it in the calculator, use your parentheses. So negative 4 squared is going to become a positive 16. Then we have minus 32 plus 15, which gives us negative 1. So we have our vertex. I'm going to write this down here. And that's the point negative 4, negative 1. Then we can find the y-intercept. The y-intercept will have an x value of 0. And the c term is 15. So that's our y-intercept. For the x-intercepts, we're going to see if we can factor. So we're going to set this equal to 0. And then first we'll see if we can factor. So multiplies to 15 and adds to 8. We can factor that, so x plus 5 and x plus 3. We're going to set each factor equal to 0. So negative 5 and negative 3. So because it's asking for the x-intercepts, we want to make sure that we write our answers as points. So we have negative 5, 0 and negative 3, 0. So now that I have these points, I can put them on the graph. So I go to negative 4, negative 1. That's my vertex. 0, 15. So I'm just going to go a little bit off the graph and I'm just going to label it. Okay, so if you're graphing something that you can't put on the graph, just put it where it would go and make sure that you label it. Then we have our x-intercepts. So negative 3, 0 and negative 5, 0. So now I can connect these and we have our parabola. Now as a review, okay, we can find other information from this. So remember, your axis of symmetry is always going to be x equals the x value of the vertex. So in this case, x equals negative 4. Then we have the a value is positive, and we can see from our graph that it's a smiley face. So we have a minimum. Now remember that it's a minimum at the y value of the vertex. So it's a minimum at negative 1. If I wanted to find the domain, Remember that it's all real numbers for every quadratic. And the range here, we focus on the y value of the vertex again, so -1, and where the other y values are. So everything is above -1. So our range will be y is greater than or equal to -1. Okay, so looking at this problem, again, we're going to start it the same way. X equals -b over 2a. So now b is a -4. So a -4 becomes a +4 over 2. So we end up with 2 as our x value. To find the y, we're going to plug it in. So 2 squared minus 4 times 2 minus 10. So 4 minus 8 minus 10 gives us -14. Okay, so our vertex that we can write down over here, that's going to be 2, -14. The y-intercept, the x value will be 0. And we look at the c term, so c is -10. And then for the x-intercepts, we're going to take the function and set it to 0. Okay, and we try to factor it first. So multiplies to -10 and adds to 4. Okay, nothing's going to work here, so that means we have to use the quadratic formula. So we have x equals, and we're going to do -b, so that becomes +4 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if we go to simplify this, we end up with 4 plus or minus the square root of 56 over 2, which can simplify. The square root of 56, we can break that down, and we end up with 2 square root 14. So you can use your trees to break that down. Think about the perfect squares that are within 56. And then we can simplify everything by 2. So we end up with 2 plus or minus the square root of 14. Now, those are my x-intercepts technically, right? I have 2 of them. I have 2 plus the square root of 14, 0, and 2 minus the square root of 14, 0. But when you go to graph it, okay, it's not easy to think about what 2 plus the square root of 14 is. You don't know where that is on the graph, so you can plug it right into your calculator and get your decimals for that. So when you're graphing, it's okay to use decimals for the graph. So I'm going to write down my x-intercepts exactly. So I have 2 plus the square root of 14, 0, and 2 minus the square root of 14, 0. But when I go to graph it, if I put them in the calculator, 2 plus the square root of 14 is going to give me 5.74. So I'm just going to draw a little arrow here, just so we can see that that is actually 5.740. And this one is actually -1.740. So when we go to put it on the graph, so I'm going to count my x's by ones and my y's by 2, because I'm kind of running out of space here. So I have 2 -14. So here's my vertex. 0, -10 is my y-intercept. Okay, and then my x-intercepts, I have 5.74, so about here, and -1.74, which is about here. So I can now connect them. Okay, and there's my graph. So again, if I want to find some information from this, I can say that my axis of symmetry is x equals 2. That's the x value of the vertex. My parabola opens up. I have a smiley face, so I have a minimum at -14, which is the y value of the vertex. My domain is all real numbers. And then my range is going to be y is greater than or equal to -14.